Dr. Nuella finished her 19th consecutive hour at Seoul Medical Center at 2:09 the morning, peeled off one pair of latex gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and thought about coffee. Not because she wanted coffee, because it was either that or think about the fact that she had not sat down since 7 a.m., had not eaten a full meal in 11 hours, and had just spent 45 minutes keeping a man alive who had arrived in her trauma bay with injuries that should have been fatal, and somehow, stubbornly, refused to cooperate with that outcome. She had won. She always won. Nobody in that hospital had noticed. In exactly 8 minutes, 2 men she had never seen before would pull her off the street with the coordinated efficiency of people who did this regularly. In exactly 40 minutes, she would be standing in a room that smelled like gunpowder and sandalwood and old money, zip tie cutting into her wrist, blindfold finally gone, face to face with a man who was dying in a way she recognized immediately because she had seen it once before, 3 years ago, in a Johannesburg trauma bay, in a patient nobody else could save. She had saved him. She wrote a paper about it afterward. A precise, detailed, groundbreaking paper that documented the only known successful reversal of a compound so rare that most toxicologists had never encountered it outside a laboratory. Almost no one read it. But someone had. She didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she was walking through level B2 of the hospital parking structure with her medical bag over one shoulder and her hospital ID still clipped to her chest and the stethoscope still around her neck because she had, as usual, forgotten to take it off. The fluorescent lights hummed the specific frequency of institutional exhaustion. Her footsteps echoed against concrete. December in Seoul had a quality to it that she had never quite gotten used to. A cold that did not announce itself dramatically the way London cold did, but settled in quietly, persistent and personal, like a conversation you could not end. She had come to Seoul for a research position. The position had evaporated before she arrived. She had stayed because Seoul Medical Center needed someone with her particular combination of trauma surgery skills and toxicology training, and because she did not have anywhere more important to be, and because it turned out that staying was something she was better at in practice than in theory. Her apartment was a 12-minute subway ride from the hospital. It had a coffee maker on a timer, a research paper due by Friday that she had not started, and a window that faced Namsan Tower, which she looked at most mornings and thought, I live here. This is where I live. As if she was still trying to convince herself. She was one of the 3 best trauma surgeons in South Korea. She ate dinner standing over a supply cart. These things were not contradictions. They were just the shape of her life. Her car was in row C, 3rd space from the elevator, same spot every night, because when your schedule had no predictable edges, you made your own where you could. She saw the van when she was 4 steps past the elevator doors. Black. Side door already open, engine running, parked at an angle that blocked the row in a way that was not accidental. 2 men standing beside it who were not on their phones, not waiting for a friend, not doing any of the things that people in parking structures at 2 a.m. do. They were watching the elevator. The moment she stepped out, they stopped watching the elevator. Her brain ran the calculation in the same sequence she used for a patient crashing on the table. Observation, pattern recognition, threat assessment, response. She had time for one word. No. Then the black cloth came down over her eyes, and the zip tie snapped around her wrist, and her medical bag hit the concrete with the specific sound of expensive equipment meeting a hard surface, and the van door closed, and Seoul disappeared. She counted turns. Left, left, long straight highway, possibly Gangnam Dairo. Right, incline, slower, winding. 41 minutes from the moment the van door closed to the moment it opened again. The air outside was colder and thinner and smelled like pine and altitude, and the particular silence of a building that had been designed to keep the city out. Hands on her arms, not rough, just purposeful, guided her across a surface that felt like stone tile, through a door, down a corridor, Another door. Then the blindfold came off, and she saw him. He was standing in the doorway across the room, or rather, he was using the doorway the way some men used everything around them, as structural support they were too proud to acknowledge needing. Tall, dark hair swept back from a face that had been built for intimidation and was currently working very hard at it. White dress shirt hanging open at the collar, the kind of open that was not casual but rather the result of a long day that had taken things from him he had not offered willingly. The shirt fell away from a chest covered in Korean tattoos, a tiger mid-roar across his sternum, a serpent coiled at his ribs. Text beside it that she could not read from this distance, but that had the particular density of something sworn rather than decorative. Gold ring on his right hand. Gold watch. The jewelry of a man who understood that everything you owned was a signal someone was always reading. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. And in the 4 seconds before anyone in that room spoke, her brain, which had spent 19 hours triaging the visible and invisible damage that human bodies sustain and conceal, cataloged what his body was telling her without his permission. The skin tone, off by 3 shades in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. The jaw set at an angle that was not anger, but was doing an excellent impression of it. The right hand, very still, in the particular way of a hand that has been told by its owner to stop trembling and is complying through an act of pure will. She had seen this before, not in a textbook, not in a case study, in a man, in Johannesburg, in her trauma bay, 3 years ago. She had saved that man. She had written a paper about it that almost no one read. The lieutenant stepped forward and explained, in the clipped English of someone who had rehearsed it, that his employer was dying, and she was going to save him. Nuella looked at the surgical instruments already laid out on the side table organized, waiting, chosen by someone who had done their research. She looked at the zip tie still on her wrist. She looked at the man in the doorway whose body was losing a war he did not yet know she had fought once before. She said very evenly, "You have the wrong doctor." The lieutenant's expression did not change. "We have a doctor. You have the wrong one." The man in the doorway spoke for the first time. His voice was low in the way of someone who had learned somewhere along the way that a quiet voice in a loud room is more dangerous than a loud one. It did not rise. It did not need to. "It doesn't matter." She held his gaze. "I beg your pardon?" Those dark eyes moved across her face with the specific quality of attention she had encountered in exactly 2 categories of person in her life. Surgeons, assessing an unfamiliar case, and people deciding in real time whether something was worth their time. He was doing both simultaneously. "I don't care whose hands you are," he said. "I care what they can do." The room held its breath. Nuella looked at the instruments. She looked at the window behind him where the lights of Seoul burned 40 floors below, indifferent and glittering, and completely unaware that she was up here. She thought about the paper. She thought about the patient in Johannesburg, and the compound in his bloodstream, and the 47 minutes it had taken her to find the reversal and the attending, who had said afterward, "Interesting case," as if she had not just invented the treatment in real time. She thought about the man in front of her whose right hand was trembling in a way he had not yet decided to acknowledge. She thought, "I know exactly what is killing you." She thought, "I am the only person in this city who does." She looked back at Kwon Jae-won, at the tattoos and the ring and the eyes that had already decided she was staying whether she agreed or not, and she said the things she had learned to say in hospital boardrooms and operating theaters and every room in her career where someone with more power than sense had assumed her presence was a given rather than a choice. Then here are my conditions. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and find out exactly how far our story is reaching. The blindfold came off slowly. Not yanked, not torn, peeled back with the precise, deliberate motion of someone who had decided that how a thing was done mattered as much as the thing itself. The hands that held it were tattooed across the knuckles, a serpent coiling up from the wrist, and they withdrew the moment the cloth cleared her eyes, stepping back before she could register them as a threat. A small courtesy. She filed that away too. Her vision adjusted in layers, the way vision always does after darkness. First light, then shape, then meaning. First, warm, low, amber, from fixtures that had no business being this expensive in a room that also contained a loaded gun on the side table. Then, depth-high ceilings, dark wood paneling that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. Heavy furniture arranged with the particular deliberateness of a room that had been designed to make a specific statement about the person who occupied it. The statement was, "Everything in here was chosen. Nothing is accidental, and the person responsible for all of it would like you to understand that before you say anything." Then the detail. The tiger painting behind the leather chair, floor to ceiling, dominating the wall the way a painting that size could only dominate if it had been chosen for exactly that purpose. A roaring tiger mid-lunge, rendered in brushstrokes that looked like they had been made fast, in a single session, by someone with something urgent to say and the skill to say it without slowing down. The throne beneath it, because that was the only accurate word for the chair, ornate dark leather with Baroque carved arms, the kind of piece that communicated its owner's relationship to authority without requiring a single word of explanation. And beside it, on a low, lacquered table she hadn't immediately noticed, a surgical instrument case, open, the contents arranged with the methodical care of someone who had received instructions about preparing for a doctor and had taken those instructions entirely seriously. They had been expecting someone, a doctor. She looked at the zip tie on her wrist, and she looked at the instruments on the table, and she felt the shape of the situation arrange itself in her mind with the same cold clarity that arrived whenever a patient came through the trauma bay in worse condition than the chart had suggested. She filed it away. She filed everything away, in those first minutes. There would be time to open the files later. The man was in the doorway. She had been peripherally aware of him since the blindfold came off the way you are peripherally aware of a change in atmospheric pressure, not by seeing it, but by feeling the air rearrange itself around a new variable. He filled the doorframe without appearing to try, which was the most dangerous kind of presence, the kind that didn't announce itself and therefore couldn't be dismissed. Tall, dark hair swept back from a forehead and jaw that looked like they had been engineered specifically for the purpose of appearing unmoved by circumstances. White dress shirt open at the collar in the way that wasn't casual but was rather the residue of a long day that had taken things from him without permission, and he hadn't yet decided whether to reassemble the image or let it go. The shirt fell open from shoulders that had clearly won negotiations with it on a regular basis, revealing a chest and upper torso covered in Korean tattoos, so dense and deliberate they read, less like decoration and more like documentation, a roaring tiger across his sternum with the same ferocity as the painting behind. Him, a serpent coiled at his rib cage, and text beside the tiger that she couldn't read from this distance, but that had the compressed weight of something sworn rather than chosen. Gold ring on his right hand. Dragon crest, heavy, the kind of ring that had been on that hand long enough to have become part of the hand's identity. Gold watch on his left wrist that caught the amber light when he shifted his weight. He shifted his weight once, just once. Then, he went entirely still in the particular way of someone who has trained stillness into their body, the same way she had trained steadiness into her hands, not naturally, but through a sustained act of will applied so consistently it had become indistinguishable from nature. And that was when she saw it. The right hand, braced against the doorframe at an angle that was not casual and not architectural. Stabilizing. The jaw set at a line that was performing anger with considerable commitment, but underneath which something else was working, something that had to do with staying upright, with maintaining vertical without appearing to require effort to do so. The skin tone wrong by 3 shades in a direction that had nothing to do with the quality of the light and everything to do with what was happening inside whatever systems were currently keeping him functional. Her brain did what it always did. She couldn't have stopped it any more than she could have stopped her heart from beating. 19 years of training and 6 years of trauma medicine had made observation into something that happened below the level of conscious decision, the way breathing did, automatic, continuous, preceding thought. She cataloged him the way she cataloged every patient who came through her bay. What is visible? What is actively being concealed? What is the gap between those two things? And what does that gap tell me about the timeline? She had working answers to all 4 questions before the man standing beside her opened his mouth. He was shorter than the man in the doorway, compact in the way of someone who had been built for efficiency rather than presence, with a face that had been trained into stillness so completely and for so long that the stillness itself had become a tell, the specific quality of a man who had learned to show nothing and had therefore forgotten that showing nothing was also a choice that could be read. He said his name was Min-jun in a tone that offered the name as a formality rather than an introduction. He explained, in English that was clipped and precise and had clearly been rehearsed, that his employer was dying and she was going to save him. Nuella looked at the surgical instruments on the table, arranged in their case with someone's best understanding of what a surgeon would need. She looked at the zip tie still cutting into her left wrist. She said very calmly, "You have the wrong person." Min-jun's expression did not change. "We have a doctor." "You have the wrong doctor." From the doorway, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned at some point that volume was for people who weren't certain they would be obeyed. "It doesn't matter." She turned to look at him directly, not because she was performing composure, but because she did not have any other way of being in a room. "I beg your pardon?" The man in the doorframe, Kwon Jae-won, though she would not know his name until later, knowing only his symptoms in this moment, moved his dark eyes across her face the way a surgeon's hands move across an unfamiliar injury. Methodical, assessing, not gentle, but not careless either. He was looking for the thing that mattered. She recognized the process because it was her own process, applied by someone else for the first time in a context she hadn't anticipated. "I don't care whose hands you are," he said. "I care what they can do." The room held itself in a particular kind of silence, the kind that follows a statement that has closed all the available doors and is waiting to see which one you try anyway. Nuella looked at him. She looked at the right hand on the doorframe and the 3-shade skin tone and the tremor he was controlling through what must have been an extraordinary act of sustained will. She looked at the tiger behind the throne. She looked at the window behind him, through which Seoul glittered 40 floors below, alive, indifferent, completely unaware that she was up here having this conversation. She thought about what she had just catalogued in his body. She thought about Johannesburg, about a trauma bay at 3 in the morning and a patient whose toxicology report had looked like something she'd never seen before and would probably never see again. About 47 hours of improvised protocol. About the paper she'd written afterward, in careful, precise language, documenting every decision she'd made and why, in the hope that the next doctor who encountered this would have something to work from. Almost no one had read it. She thought, "I know what is killing this man. I am very probably the only person in this city who does," she said. "Then here are my conditions." The conditions were not negotiable. She said this at the outset, clearly and without apology, and she could see from the quality of stillness that moved through the 4 men in the room that this was not the choreography they were accustomed to. There was a sequence that played out in rooms like this one. With men like these, a sequence of demand, consideration, response, and the response was almost never a clean yes, because a clean yes from a man in this position would require admitting a position of need, and men who sat in Baroque leather thrones in front of tiger paintings tended to experience need as a structural threat. Nuella did not perform the dance. She laid out the conditions the way she presented a surgical plan in order of critical priority, with the reasoning attached to each one. Because she had spent 6 years in rooms where people with more institutional authority than clinical knowledge tried to override her judgment, and the only reliable defense against that was to make the logic so visible and so sound that overriding it required a person to openly choose the worse outcome. Most people, when forced to choose that explicitly, did not choose it. A proper medical suite. Not this room, which was impressive and entirely unsuitable. She needed surfaces she could sterilize, lighting calibrated for procedure rather than atmosphere, and enough unobstructed space to work without having to think about who was standing where. The room they were currently in had a gun on a side table and furniture worth more than her annual salary, and precisely none of what she required. A supply list. She would write it out in full, with quantities and acceptable substitutions noted, and she needed everything on it within 12 hours, not 14, not 18. 12, because the clock she was working against did not adjust for logistical convenience. Access. Unobstructed, unrestricted access to the patient. No one in her way during a procedure. No one questioning her assessments in real time. No one deciding midway through a treatment that they knew better because they had been in the room longer and had more tattoos. When she was working, she was the only authority in that room on the subject of what happened next. And when it was done, when the man in the chair was alive and stable and no longer required her specific set of skills to remain that way, she walked out, intact, unharmed, with her medical bag returned to her, containing everything that had been in it when she arrived, including the research paper draft she had been carrying around in the front pocket for 2 weeks because she kept thinking she would finish it on the subway. She stopped speaking. The 4 men looked at Jae-won. Jae-won looked at her. The look lasted long enough that she was aware of it as a specific event, not a glance, not an assessment, but something more like a decision being made in real time, with her as the primary variable. She held it without adjustment. She had stood in operating rooms beside surgeons who used silence as a pressure tool. He had learned in her 2nd year of medical school to stop doing the thing her body wanted to do when powerful people held eye contact past comfort, that microscopic retreat, the chin dropping by 2 degrees, the shoulders rounding inward, the almost imperceptible signal of, "You win, I was smaller than I appeared." She had burned that reflex out of herself through deliberate practice, and she was not about to let it regenerate now. He said, "All right." No qualifier. No modification added at the last moment to restore the appearance of control. No implicit renegotiation dressed up as agreement. Just 2 syllables that accepted every condition she had stated, cleanly and without drama. He pushed off the doorframe. She clocked the micro-adjustment in his weight distribution that the movement required, and he revealed nothing of it and walked out of the room. And Min-jun looked at the 3 remaining men with an expression that she couldn't quite categorize, and then looked back at her. She said, "I'll need a pen and paper for the supply list." She spent the first night mapping the compound. It wasn't a conscious decision in the sense of sitting down and deciding to do it. It was simply what her brain did when it had processed the immediate crisis and needed to turn its energy toward the next variable. The same methodical attention she had applied to Jae-won's symptoms and her conditions list now turned itself to the building she was inside, and she let it, because she was not going to pretend she had stopped thinking about going home. She was thinking about going home. She was also being realistic about the gap between that thought and any immediate action, and the productive thing to do with that gap was to understand her environment. The medical suite was on the 3rd floor, and she had to concede that whoever had prepared it had done a reasonable job with limited notice, proper surfaces, a light rig she could adjust, enough space to move. Somebody here had thought about what a surgeon actually needed, which was either very good intelligence work or someone on staff with medical training. She noted that, too. She walked the corridors after Min-jun showed her to the suite and left. Her footsteps were quiet on the stone tile, and she moved without hurrying, which was the way to move in a building like this, purposeful but not urgent, the gait of someone who belonged where they were. She counted 6 men on the ground floor, 4 more on the perimeter visible through the lower windows, Cameras at every exterior corner with overlapping fields of view that left very few blind spots. The architecture of the building itself was a security measure. Long corridors with clear sight lines, minimal interior cover, doors that were heavy and opened inward. She found the kitchen on the second floor, stainless surfaces and a refrigerator stocked in the way of someone who had been told to prepare for an indeterminate stay and had done so thoroughly. She found the library on the fourth floor, which surprised her, a real library. Walls of books, a reading chair by the window, the specific smell of a room where paper had been kept for a long time. She found, on the top floor at the end of a corridor lined with paintings she didn't stop to examine, a room with a floor-to-ceiling window that faced Namsan Tower and the city below it. She stood at that window for 4 minutes. Seoul was still down there. The hospital was still down there. Her apartment, her overdue paper, the coffee maker she left on a timer every morning, all of it was still existing. 11 minutes from here by van on a dark December road, continuing without her with the indifference of things that don't require an audience to keep going. She stood there until she had finished thinking about it. Then Min-jun appeared at the end of the corridor with a notepad and a pen, and she went back to write the supply list. The supplies arrived in 11 hours and 40 minutes. She unpacked them with gloves on, working through each item against the list she had written, checking quantities and expiration dates, and grade classifications with the thoroughness she applied to every supply check before a procedure. Because the 2 times in her career she had skipped a supply check had been the 2 times she reached for something mid-operation that wasn't there. She did not make the same mistake 3 times. She found 3 substitutions lower grade than specified, not catastrophically so, but not acceptable either. She sent Min-jun back with the 3 items annotated in red, and a note that said, "These are not interchangeable with what I asked for, and here is why." Because she had learned that people responded better to reasoning than to authority, when the authority in question was hers specifically, in rooms like this one. He returned 40 minutes later with the correct items, and an expression she had begun to notice was his default for situations he had not fully mapped. A very slight tightening around the eyes, controlled quickly. She filed that away. The first proper procedure happened that afternoon. She set it up herself, because she always set up herself. She had worked with scrub nurses she trusted absolutely, and still set up herself. Because the relationship between a surgeon's hands and the tools those hands would use was a relationship that did not benefit from intermediaries. She arranged the instruments in the sequence she used them, checked the lighting twice, sterilized the surfaces, and then pulled on her second glove and went to the door and said, "I'm ready." They brought him in, and he sat in the chair without being asked, which told her he had been expecting this, had been thinking about it, had decided in advance how he was going to behave in this room. The 2 men who had accompanied him arranged themselves against the far wall in the posture of people who had been told to be present and had made their peace with it. Min-jun took his position at the door. She knelt beside the chair, opened her case on the floor beside her, and looked at his arm. The wound site was what she had expected from the symptom progression. The tissue response consistent with the compound she was now almost entirely certain she was dealing with. The pattern of cellular behavior she had documented in those 6 weeks in Johannesburg, more clearly visible now than it had been in the initial assessment. She had been right. She was almost always right, which was something she had stopped finding remarkable and started finding simply factual. The way you find the weight of a familiar instrument factual, neither pride nor modesty, just the accurate measurement of a known variable. She began to clean it. He watched her hands. She was peripherally aware of this, the quality of his attention directed at her work rather than at the ceiling or the middle distance, the way most patients directed their attention during uncomfortable procedures. He was watching the way she moved, the sequence of her decisions, the particular economy of motion that trauma surgery required, and that she had developed over years of working in conditions where wasted movement had consequences. She kept her focus on the tissue and the instruments, and the information those two things were giving her in real time. "Does it hurt?" she asked. It was a clinical question. She needed to know how the peripheral nervous system was responding, whether the compound had reached the nerve pathways yet, what the pain distribution told her about where the toxin was concentrating. It was not kindness. She had learned to be clear about the difference, because conflating the two led to clinical decisions contaminated by sentiment, and sentiment in a trauma bay cost people their lives. "Yes," he said. He said it the way a person says a thing they have decided in advance not to let signify anything flat, complete, final. Then, before she had done anything except receive the answer, "Keep going." She kept going. She was aware of him watching throughout. Most patients, in her experience, negotiated a relationship with the procedure. They looked away, or they closed their eyes, or they performed stoicism for an invisible audience by staring at a fixed point. He did none of these things. He watched her hands move over his arm the way he had watched her face when she first walked into the room. The quality of attention that preceded and accompanied decision-making, the focus of someone extracting information and putting it somewhere. She found, somewhere in the 40 minutes of the first procedure, that she did not mind it. This was interesting. Most people's attention during a procedure was noise she filtered out. His was something she registered without needing to filter, which was either a sign of something or a product of the adrenaline of the past 12 hours, and she did not have time to determine which one right now. She finished, closed the case, pulled off one glove and then the other, and made her first procedural notes on the treatment record she had started in the back of her journal because no one had provided her with proper documentation forms. She would address that tomorrow. She did not look up from the notes when she said, "You can go." He went. She heard the chair and the footsteps and the door. She heard Min-jun follow. She kept writing. The intelligence file was in the third drawer of the desk in the medical suite. Min-jun had placed it there the previous evening with the information that it contained Jae-won's full medical history and the toxicology data his team had gathered since the poisoning. She had reviewed the toxicology data the first night and confirmed what her clinical assessment had already told her. This was the compound, the specific compound. She was right, and she had been working from that confirmation, but she had not yet gone through the file page by page. She went through it on the morning of the third day, methodically, starting from the beginning. She found the paper on page 47. She recognized it before she had finished reading the title. She had written it. She had written every sentence on the 6 dense pages that followed, had revised it 17 times before submission, had held her breath for 6 weeks, waiting for the peer review response, and then felt the particular deflation of having work accepted into a journal that almost no one in her immediate professional circle had ever heard of. Her supervisor in Johannesburg had said good, "Well done," in the tone of a person who had already moved on to the next thing. The attending she had been working under when she developed the protocol had retired 3 months later without mentioning it again. The paper documented the only known successful reversal of the compound that was currently killing Kwon Jae-won. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. She reconstructed the sequence of events from the beginning, placing them in their actual chronological order rather than the order she had experienced them. Jae-won's intelligence team had identified the compound after the poisoning at the summit. They had searched existing medical literature for any documented treatment or reversal. They had found this paper. They had traced the author Dr. Nuella, Seoul Medical Center, trauma surgery, and sent men to the hospital parking structure on a Tuesday morning at 2:17 in Uddevamamder to bring her in. There had been another doctor, a woman who drove the same make of car, worked the same shift end time, parked on the same level. The actual target, someone whose name she still didn't know, whose involvement in whatever intelligence network surrounded this situation she had not yet mapped. She had already been moved by the rival syndicate, relocated or warned off the moment the grab went sideways, and it became apparent that the wrong person had been taken. And Nuella had been walking through level B2 at 2:09 a.m. with her medical bag over one shoulder, thinking about coffee, which was the kind of detail that made a person understand why it was not useful to try to identify patterns in the universe's decisions. They had been looking for the author of this paper. They had found her. In the wrong parking structure, on the wrong level, attached to the wrong person, by the most improbable coincidence she had encountered in 28 years of a life that had not, until now, contained any notable improbabilities. The mistake and the mission had collided, and the collision had produced, against all probability, the correct outcome. She thought about telling him. She turned this over carefully, the way she turned over a difficult clinical decision, examining the information, the timing, the likely response, the variables she could control and the ones she couldn't. There was an argument for telling him immediately. Clarity, transparency, the establishment of a relationship in which both parties had access to the same facts. There was an argument for waiting. She did not yet fully understand what it meant, and she had a firm professional policy against reporting a diagnosis before she was certain of both the diagnosis and its implications. The second argument was stronger at this moment. She closed the file. She put on her gloves and began the third day's procedures with the same steady hands she brought to every procedure. And she kept the information in the same place. She kept everything she wasn't ready to act on, yet noted, filed, available. He found her at midnight, reviewing his charts by the light of the desk lamp. She had not been expecting him. The compound was quiet at this hour, the particular quiet of a building that contained a certain number of people who were all very good at being silent, which was different from emptiness. She had been alone in the medical suite since 11, working through the day's observations, building the treatment timeline into the format she used for complex multivariable cases, a clean progression chart with the decision nodes mapped against the physiological trajectory so she could see the shape of the problem and, more importantly, the shape of the window she was working within. The door opened and she looked up, and he was there. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, which she had come to understand was a posture of watching rather than confrontation, the arrangement his body defaulted to when he had not yet decided whether to enter a space. He had changed into a dark shirt, buttoned most of the way, and there was something different about his face at this hour, not softer exactly, but less constructed. The architecture of his expression reduced to its load-bearing elements without the additional structure he maintained during the day. "You should be resting," she said. She looked back at the chart. "I don't sleep much." She made a note in the margin about the treatment schedule adjustment she was considering for the following morning and did not respond to that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not afraid of me?" Not a question, not an accusation. The statement of someone examining a fact that had presented itself as unusual, holding it to the light. She considered the observation with the same precision she applied to everything, because she had learned that imprecise self-assessment was as dangerous in its way as imprecise diagnosis. Was she afraid of him? She was in a compound on a hill in Gangnam, with a zip tie mark still fresh on her wrist, and a man she had met 40 hours ago blocking the door. And the reasonable answer to that question, the answer that any person operating with all their faculties would give, was yes. Some version of yes. But the particular quality of fear that she associated with the word, the body-level animal response, the hands that shook, the mind that contracted toward the exit rather than the problem, that was not what she was experiencing. What she was experiencing was something colder and more functional, a heightened alertness that was directing itself toward information rather than escape. That was not the same thing. "I've worked in trauma for 6 years, she said. She looked up when she said it, because this was the kind of statement that required a face behind it. "You are not the most dangerous thing I've had my hands on today." He looked at her. The expression shifted in a way she had started to track, not a large shift, barely visible, but consistent enough that she had begun to catalog it as its own category of response, something in him oriented toward attention. Not softened, not warmed, sharpened. The specific quality of a person registering that they are in the presence of something that is worth the full capacity of their focus. He was paying attention to her, not to the surgeon, not to the medical asset, not to the wrong person who had nevertheless turned out to be the right one. To her, in the particular and specific way that she had not been paid attention to in a very long time, in rooms that were supposed to be the rooms where her work was seen, by people who were supposed to be seeing it. She noted this. She noted that she had noticed it. She noted both of these things with the same clinical care she brought to everything, and looked back at the chart. He stood in the doorway for another few minutes. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the lamp and the window and the city outside it present, noted, not requiring a response. Then she heard him leave. She sat in the quiet for a moment after, her pen not moving on the chart. Then she made the note she had been about to make, and moved on to the next variable. Day 4 began like the others had begun, and proceeded like the others had preceded the morning procedures at 7, the treatment notes at 9, Min-jun at 11 with the daily supply delivery that she had reduced to a 15-minute review now that the substitution problem had been resolved. She worked through the morning's data, updated the progression chart, began mapping the decision architecture for the procedure she was building toward the intervention that would require more than the daily protocols if it was going to work. The procedure she had designed once before in a Johannesburg trauma bay, and had never stopped carrying in the back of her mind as a thing she might someday need again. The compound was quiet in the early afternoon. The particular quiet of a Tuesday. If this was a Tuesday, she had lost exact track of the days, which was unusual for her. She was ordinarily precise about time in a way that approached compulsion, but something about the compound's rhythms had loosened that precision, and she had stopped trying to tighten it. She found the gate at 14 minutes past 2. She had been mapping the east corridor thoroughness. Nothing specific when she noticed the gap. The guards who held the eastern perimeter rotation had completed their cycle 12 minutes early. She knew this because she had been tracking the rotation schedules since the first night, noting them in the margins of her journal in the same column where she noted the treatment observations, because information was information, and she kept all of it. The replacement guards would not arrive for another 3 hours and 46 minutes. The security camera above the eastern gate had a field of view that she had observed over the past 3 days, cut off precisely at the left edge of the access panel. She stood in the east corridor for a moment. Then she walked to the gate. The air outside was December cold and thin at this altitude, carrying the smell of pine from the tree line along the compound's eastern fence, and the sound of the city far below, which was not a sound so much as a frequency, Seoul at 2 in the afternoon, alive and moving. Beyond the gate, a road wound down through the trees toward a junction she estimated was 4 minutes of walking from here, from which the main arterial was visible. Taxi, phone, hospital. 12 minutes. She could be in her apartment in 12 minutes. She stood at the gate with her medical bag over her shoulder. The same bag, the one she had been carrying when they took her, returned to her on the second day with everything in it: intact instruments, documentation, the research paper draft in the front pocket, her hospital ID still clipped to the interior strap. She thought about the coffee maker on its timer. She thought about the paper she had not submitted and was now, technically, 4 days late on. She thought about her apartment and the Namsan Tower view and the subway platform she used every morning, and the colleagues who had not yet noticed she was gone, which they probably hadn't. She had covered a colleague's shift once for 9 days, and the attending hadn't remarked on it until day 11. She thought about the man 2 floors above her, whose treatment protocol she had designed and begun, and whose physiological timeline she had mapped with precision. She trusted the way she trusted her hands. The window she was working within. The procedure she had been building toward for 3 days, which could not be paused at a convenient moment, because it was not the kind of procedure that had a pause function. She stood at the gate for 11 minutes. Then she went back inside. She told herself it was the ethics. A doctor did not abandon a patient mid-protocol. This was a principle she held without exception. had held without exception since the second year of her residency, when she had watched a colleague walk away from a difficult case and seen what that decision had cost. And she had decided then that she would never be the surgeon who chose the easier thing when the harder thing was the right one. She held this principle because it was right, and it governed her decision, and that was what she told herself as she walked back through the east corridor and up 2 flights of stairs to the medical suite. She did not examine what else might have been in those 11 minutes. She had her gloves in her hands when the shouting started. Not anger panic, which she could distinguish at 40 meters by the particular frequency it put in a person's voice, the way controlled training gives way to raw response. It was coming from 2 floors above, multiple voices, the specific register of people who had been selected and trained for discipline and were currently failing to hold it. She was out the door and moving up the stairs before she had processed the decision to do so, the same mobilization response that carried her across a trauma bay when a code sounded automatic, directional, faster than thought. The room was chaos, in the particular way of chaos that happens when trained people encounter a situation outside their training. 3 of his men standing in a cluster near the bed, talking over each other, none of them doing anything with their hands that had any connection to what was actually happening. Jae-won on the bed with his eyes open and his jaw locked and his body working harder at the business of staying alive than she had seen it work yet. The signs she had been monitoring for crossing into the range she had designated as the intervention threshold. She walked through the 3 men, not around them through, because they were in her way and she didn't have the seconds to route around them, and they moved when she moved into them because she did not slow down. "Out," she said, and did not watch them leave, and they left. 40 minutes. She moved through the procedure with the focus that arrived when everything else in her life became irrelevant. The tunnel of absolute present tense that she had discovered in her second year of medicine and had been trying to find the edges of ever since. The state in which there was only the problem and her hands and the space between them. She had worked in this state during power outages and supply shortages and cases that had no precedent in any literature she had read. She worked in it now. When it was over, when his vitals had moved back above the floor she had set for acceptable, when the immediate crisis had resolved into the ongoing crisis, which was manageable, she stepped back from the bed. Her legs carried her as far as the wall, and then they decided that was sufficient, and she sat down on the floor with her back against it, and her gloves in her lap and her breathing doing the thing it did after a hard procedure, slower, deliberate, the body recalibrating from the emergency register back to the standard one. He was looking at her. The quality of it was nothing like any of the looks he had given her before. Before, there had been assessment, the weighing of a variable, the cold efficiency of a man who processed people and situations as information to be used. This was different, quieter, less armored than his usual stillness, as if the past 40 minutes had suspended, just temporarily, the process by which he kept himself unreadable. Something in his face was open in a way she didn't yet have the vocabulary for, and she was a person who had a word for most things. "You came back," he said. His voice was not fully steady. She noted this carefully, because Kwon Jae-won's voice was always steady, and an unsteady variable in a previously stable metric meant something. "I was treating a patient," she said. She pulled one glove off, then the other. She folded them together the way she always did. "I don't leave patients." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted a precise second longer than it needed to. He didn't say anything else. She hadn't expected him to. She sat on the floor until her legs had decided they were prepared to try again, and then she stood up and went back to the medical suite and opened the treatment record and sat down at the desk. She wrote the notes. She did not examine the first breath she took when she sat down, which was deeper than the breath she'd taken in the doorway, and felt different from the ones that had come before it. She wrote the notes, and she moved on to the next entry, and she did not look up from the desk until the lamp had been on for 3 hours and the city outside the window had gone from evening to night. By the 5th day, The compound had stopped being a problem and had started being a place. She recognized this shift without entirely welcoming it, because she understood what it meant, and she understood what it cost. Every environment she had spent more than 72 hours in had done this to her. London had done it. Johannesburg had done it. The Fellowship Hospital in Seoul had done it even before she decided to stay. It was a function of how her brain worked. She was a person who mapped things, and mapped things, and mapped them until she understood them. And once she understood a thing, she could no longer experience it as foreign. She had tried to stop doing this in her personal life with limited success. In her professional life, she had decided it was an asset and stopped trying. The compound's rhythms had organized themselves around her routines. Medical suite at 7, the morning procedure that he arrived to on time, and sat through in the same particular silence of someone who had decided exactly how they were going to behave in this room, and was executing that decision. Treatment notes at 9, supply review at 11. The long, quiet afternoon hours, when the building held its breath between its various purposes, and she sat at the desk with the charts and the research paper. She had started writing in the margins of her treatment journal, not because she had planned to, but because her mind at rest defaulted to drafting and she had stopped fighting it. On the afternoon of the 5th day, she looked up from the desk and found him at the window. He had come in at some point during the hour she had been working with her head down quietly, without announcing himself, in the way that she had begun to recognize as his approach to any space he was uncertain about entering. He had a book from the 4th-floor library, she thought, though she couldn't see the spine from here. He was ostensibly reading it. He was also, in the way she had catalogued in the East Corridor on day 4, maintaining a peripheral awareness of everything else in the room that had nothing to do with the book. She looked at him for a moment. She looked back at the chart. He stayed until 6, when Min-jun appeared at the door and said something low in Korean, and he closed the book and left without looking back. The book remained on the windowsill. She did not pick it up, and she did not look at what it was, because there was a category of information she was currently keeping at a distance, and that book was in it. He asked about Johannesburg on the morning of the 6th day. He did it the way he did everything, without preamble, without apparent transition from the previous silence, as if the question had been present in the room for some time, and he had simply decided the moment had arrived to release it. They were in the medical suite, his arm extended across the table, her hands moving through the morning procedure with the economy that 6 years of repetition had made automatic. What was Johannesburg like? She considered the question. She had been asked it before, many times, by people who wanted the version that explained the credential, without requiring them to sit with its texture. She had given that version reliably. She sat with it now and found that she didn't want to give it, which was itself information. Hard, she said. Understaffed by 40%, minimum. Cases came in that would have been stabilized and transferred hours earlier in a better resourced system. You learned to complete things there because completion was the only option. There was no one downstream to hand a difficult case to, no attending to escalate to, nothing but the patient and whatever you could figure out before the window closed. I learned more in 18 months there than in the 4 years before it. That's where you learn to do this, he said. She was mid-procedure. She did not look up. That's where I learned most things. She finished and began the notes, and he sat with his arm resting on the table in the posture of someone who had not yet decided to leave. You lost someone there, he said. The statement arrived with the precision of someone who had been listening carefully enough to hear the thing she hadn't said. She went still for a measured moment, not frozen, just still, in the way of someone placing a piece of information in its correct position before continuing. She kept writing. A patient, she said. A difficult case. I made every correct call and he died anyway, which is something that happens in trauma medicine and which you understand as an abstract before it happens to you and understand entirely differently afterward. She did not look at the notes. She was not reading them. After, she said, I built a gap between myself and the work. Professional distance. Every supervisor I've ever had has told me it's appropriate. And they're right, a surgeon who becomes emotionally involved in cases makes worse decisions and carries damage forward that accumulates. It is appropriate. It is also the reason I eat dinner standing over a supply cart at 1 in the morning and consider that a sufficient life. She closed the notes. She looked up, because this was the kind of admission that required looking at a person's face when you made it not for their reaction, but because averting your eyes when you said a true thing was a form of retraction, and she had said it and she meant it, and she was not going to retract it. He was looking at her with the quiet expression, the one she had catalogued on day 4 when his defenses had temporarily dropped, the one that sat in the centimeter of space between his other expressions, present in the moments when the armor fell back and something underneath it looked out, the expression she still did not have a precise name for, which was unusual for her. He said nothing. She said, "Your turn." He held her gaze for a moment that contained several things she was not yet prepared to inventory. Then he stood, straightened his shirt, and walked out. She sat with the fact of that for exactly 1 minute. Then something that was not quite a smile moved across her face, brief and private, and she picked up the next chart. He said nothing about himself that day, but the book was on the windowsill, and she caught him in the afternoon with her medical journal open on the table before him, not her treatment record, which she kept secured, but the research journal she referenced during planning, the one with the Johannesburg data and the theoretical framework for the protocol she was developing. He was reading it with the focused, cover-to-cover attention of someone taking a thing seriously. He placed it on the table face down when he heard her step in the doorway. She walked to the supply cabinet. She did not comment. She set up the afternoon procedure and said his name, Jae-won, and he stood and crossed the room and sat in the chair, and neither of them referred to the journal, and she thought that was exactly the right call. That night she woke to silence. Not the silence of an empty corridor, the other kind, the kind that has a presence in it, the quality of stillness that exists just outside a door, when the person on the other side of it is very carefully not making a sound. She had learned to distinguish these two things during her residency, on call in a hospital that never slept, because the ability to determine from inside a room whether the sound outside it required a response was a skill worth having. She lay still. She counted to 10. She got up. He was in the hallway outside the medical suite with his back against the wall and his knees bent, head tilted back against the wood paneling, eyes open and directed at the ceiling, not guarding the room, not watching the corridor for movement, just occupying the hallway the way someone occupies a space when they cannot be somewhere else but have not yet decided where they can be. She stood in the doorway. He said, "Couldn't sleep," before she could ask, in the tone of someone providing information rather than offering explanation. She looked at him. He looked at the ceiling. She considered the various responses available to her and weighed them against each other with the same instrument she used for every consequential decision, and then she stepped back and left the door open behind her and went back to bed. She did not hear him come in. The floor was stone, and he was, she had observed, constitutionally incapable of moving loudly. But when she woke at 6, and the early light was coming through the window at the angle it came through when the door had been left open all night, a 6-degree shift in the light distribution she had catalogued without meaning. 2, in the first 3 mornings there was a quality to the air in the room that was not the quality of an empty room. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. She thought about the gate. She thought about the 11 minutes. She thought about the question she had not fully answered to herself in that east corridor on day 4, and the fact that she was still not answering it, and the fact that she had stopped expecting herself to. Then she got up. She washed her hands. She put on her gloves. She went to begin the morning procedures. The intelligence came through on the morning of the 6th day, and she knew something had changed before anyone told her, because the compound changed pitch. She had been living inside its rhythms long enough to have learned its registers, the baseline frequency of a fortified building between crises, the particular density of quiet that existed when the men on the perimeter were alert, but had nothing specific to be alert about. The way sound traveled differently through the corridors, when people were moving with purpose rather than routine. That morning she woke to a building that had shifted into a different key entirely, and she lay still for precisely the amount of time it took her to identify what she was hearing. And then she got up and began the morning procedure notes, because the procedure notes needed to happen regardless of whatever the building was doing. Min-jun came to the medical suite at 8 rather than 11, which was the first deviation from the established schedule in 6 days, he said, with the controlled economy of a man who had already processed his own response to the information and was now simply delivering it, that there had been a development, and Jae-won was convening a meeting. She was to remain in the medical suite until the meeting concluded. She said, "What kind of development?" He said, "The kind that doesn't concern the medical situation." She looked at him. She said, "I see." She waited 4 minutes after he left. Then she picked up the treatment record and walked out of the medical suite and down the corridor toward the sound of voices. The room they were using was on the 2nd floor, a room she had mapped on the first night but not entered, large enough to hold a table that seated 10 and currently held 7 men, all of them standing, several of them talking at once in Korean, and at the head of the table, Jae-won. She had seen him in multiple registers over 6 days, the enforced stillness of a man managing symptoms, the guarded quiet of the hallway at 3 a.m., the concentrated attention of the medical suite. She had not yet seen him like this. The difference was structural. Every line of him had reorganized around a different center of gravity. He was standing at the head of the table with both hands flat on its surface, speaking in a low voice that nonetheless cut through the other voices in the room without raising itself. And the men around the table were not simply quiet. They were the specific quiet of people who have made an internal adjustment, who have recalibrated toward the voice the way a room of musicians recalibrates toward the tuning note without discussing it. The authority was not performed. It was simply the truth of the room, rearranging itself around him the way matter rearranges around gravity. Every head turned when she walked in. The talking stopped. Jae-won looked at her with an expression that contained a question he had not decided whether to ask out loud. She said, "I need 2 minutes." One of the men, older, with a close-shaved head and the posture of someone who had been doing this for a very long time, began to say something in Korean that she did not need to understand to recognize as an objection. Jae-won said something short. The man stopped. She set the treatment record on the table and did not open it, because she knew what was in it and did not need the page. 6 days, she said. That is the window before the toxin reaches the cardiac tissue in a way that reversal becomes structurally impossible. Not difficult, impossible. 6 days from today, which means the procedure I have been building toward for the past week needs to happen within that window regardless of what else is happening in and around this building. She looked around the table. I don't know what your intelligence says about the timing of whatever is coming. I know what my treatment data says about the timing of what is already here. Those two timelines are going to intersect, and when they do, this is the variable that doesn't move. The men looked at Jae-won. Jae-won was looking at her. The quality of it was the same quality she had first noticed when she walked through the wrong room door on the first morning. The assessing focus, the decision being made in real time, the specific weight of a person who was deciding whether to trust an unfamiliar variable in a high-stakes situation. "What do you need?" he said. She had the list already prepared. She had prepared it 2 days ago, because the treatment timeline had always been moving toward this point, and she had known it. And the habit of planning ahead of the crisis rather than during it was one she had developed in a Johannesburg trauma bay and had never unlearned. She placed the list on the table. He read it. He handed it to Min-jun without looking away from her. 3 hours, he said. She nodded and picked up the treatment record and walked back out. The corridor outside was empty. She stood in it for a moment, aware of the building's altered frequency, sharper now, more directional. The specific tension of a structure that had identified a threat vector and was orienting itself toward it. She had worked in hospitals under emergency protocols, under siege conditions in Johannesburg when a gang war had sent 17 people through the bay doors in 40 minutes. She knew what it felt like to work inside a building that was preparing for something. She went back to the medical suite and began the morning procedure. Min-jun appeared in the doorway 40 minutes after the council dispersed. She was updating the progression chart, tracking the treatment markers against the timeline she had mapped. She did not look up immediately. She had developed, over 6 days, the habit of letting Min-jun announce himself with movement rather than speech, because she had learned that the gap between his arrival and his first word was itself informative. The length of the pause, the quality of it, told her things that his carefully controlled voice did not. The pause was longer than usual. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his weight distributed in the posture that she had catalogued as his default for situations he had not fully resolved. He said that the items on her list would be delivered within the hour. He said that 2 additional medical personnel had been sourced for the procedure, both with surgical training, neither of them what she would have specified, but both of them capable of following instruction. He said that the perimeter protocols had been updated, and she would notice changes to the guard rotation beginning this evening. He said all the right things. She watched his eyes while he said them. There was something in them that she had begun tracking 3 days ago without fully acknowledging that she was tracking it. A quality of careful management. The specific micro-adjustment that occurred in a person's face when they were presenting information they had edited before delivery. She had seen it in patients who were not telling her everything about their symptoms. She had seen it in administrators who were not telling her everything about the hospital's liability position. She recognized it because she recognized the effort it required, and she had learned that the effort was always legible if you were looking at the right thing. She filed it. She placed it beside the other things she had been filing from Min-jun, and she looked at the shape they made together, and she thought, not yet, but soon. She said, "Thank you, Min-jun." He nodded and left. She looked at the progression chart for a long moment. Then she turned the page and began building the surgical plan. The morning of the 7th day arrived in the specific gray of a Seoul winter that had decided not to perform no drama, no particular beauty, just the flat, honest light of a city in December going about its business without making any promises about it. She had been awake for an hour before it was light, sitting at the desk with the toxicology data spread before her, following a thread she had first noticed 2 days ago and had been tracking since then with the deliberate patience of someone who needed to be certain before they named what they were looking at. She was now certain. The toxin's progression markers had a timeline embedded in them, not the clinical timeline of how the compound moved through a body, which she knew in granular detail, but a different timeline, hidden inside the first one. The specific rate of the initial metabolic response, the precise window of the first symptomatic presentation, the exact interval between each subsequent escalation in the cardiac markers. These numbers were too clean. In her experience, poisoning cases had variability. The body introduced noise into every system it processed: individual metabolism, hydration, stress response, 100 compounding variables that meant no 2 cases of the same compound presented on an identical schedule. The variability was the norm. Absence of variability was not a medical phenomenon. Absence of variability was a controlled delivery. Someone had known the precise moment of ingestion at the summit. Not the day, not the hour, the moment. Someone had known which glass, which table position, which specific point in the evening sequence. Someone had known, and had told the Shin faction, and had been watching the timeline ever since with the intimate knowledge of a person who understood exactly what they had set in motion. She laid the data points out in sequence on the page. The way she laid out a differential diagnosis, each item on its own line, the pattern visible when you arranged them correctly, and invisible when you didn't. Then, she went through the supply delivery records from the past 6 days, the substitutions, the delays, the questions that had redirected her attention at specific moments. She had noted each one separately, in the margins, because everything got noted. Now she read them in sequence. Every delay had occurred at a point in the treatment protocol, where acceleration of a specific element would have compressed the toxin's activity into a narrower window, creating a steeper progression curve, reducing the usable treatment window by 20 to 30%. Every substitution had involved components whose lower-grade replacement would have produced a marginally slower pharmacological effect. Every redirecting question had come at a moment when she had been about to make a decision that would have moved the treatment forward more aggressively. Individually, each of these things had a reasonable explanation. Supply chains had variance, substitutions happened, questions were asked. In sequence, across 6 days, from the same person, they were a pattern. She sat with this for 20 minutes. She was not angry, because anger was a physiological state that cost metabolic resources she needed for other things. She was not frightened, because fear was a signal designed to prompt action, and she already knew what action she was going to take. She was something quieter and more complete, the particular state of a person who has understood a thing fully and now has to decide what to do with the understanding. She found Min-jun in the corridor outside the equipment room at 9:30. She said, "I need to talk to you. Come with me." She brought him to the medical suite and closed the door and sat down at the desk and put the pages in front of him in the same order she had arranged them. Data first, pattern second, conclusion last. The same way she presented a diagnosis, she did not raise her voice. She did not frame it as an accusation before she had presented the evidence, because accusation before evidence was not how she operated, and was not, in her experience, how you got a true answer from a person who was already carrying something heavy. She said, "Walk me through this." He looked at the pages. The pause was 23 seconds. She counted. When he looked up, the careful management in his face was gone. What was underneath it was not what she had expected, not calculation, not hostility, not the particular cold assessment of a person deciding how to control a situation that had gone sideways. It was exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight that was always going to become too heavy, and who had known it was going to, and who had been waiting not for the weight to lift, but for it to finally be put down. He told her. A sister, 24 years old. The Shin faction had taken her 11 months ago, not violently, not dramatically, but with the practiced ease of people who had done it before, and who understood that the most effective leverage was the kind that didn't make noise. They had taken her because they knew about Min-jun, knew his position and his access, and the particular weight he carried in Jae-won's operation. And they had made the calculation that a man would do a great many things for a sister that he would not do for money or ambition or fear. They had been right. He had not been asked to kill Jae-won. He had been asked to create conditions, to ensure that the treatment, when it came, was slower than it needed to be, to buy the Shin faction the time to position their strike, and to ensure that when they came, Jae-won would be in a weakened enough state that the outcome would be determined before the fight began. He had done exactly what they asked. And he had been doing it with the knowledge of what it meant, and the knowledge had been inside him for 11 months like a secondary wound, the kind that doesn't bleed externally but costs more than the visible one. Nuella looked at him for a long moment when he finished. She thought about a lot of things in that moment. She thought about the 11 minutes at the Eastern Gate on day 4. She thought about the decisions a person made when the thing at stake was someone they could not afford to lose. She thought about the patient in Johannesburg, whose case had given her the data in this paper, and the 47 hours she had spent developing a treatment that didn't exist yet because she was not able to stop until she found it, and the fact that she had never been able to name, cleanly and precisely, What had been driving her in those 47 hours? She thought about the fact that she understood Min-jun in a way she had not expected to, and that understanding was not the same as absolution, and she was not the person whose place it was to offer absolution. She said, "I need you to not do anything for the next 8 hours. I will tell him, but not until after the procedure, because I need you operational until it's done, and I need him stable for it. And neither of those conditions survives this conversation happening right now." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" He said yes. His voice was the flattest she had heard it. She looked at the window. The gray morning had not changed. The city below it was still going about its business. Then one of the men on the perimeter rotation appeared on the camera feed visible from the desk monitor, and he was not walking the rotation path he was running. And behind him on the road below the tree line, moving fast and without lights, were 3 black vehicles that were not Jae-won's. She stood up. "Hold that," she said. "We're out of time." The sound arrived before the light did. The first impact was on the northern wall, a percussion she felt in the floor before she heard it with her ears, the specific signature of a shaped charge rather than conventional entry, which told her something about the Shin faction's preparation that she filed in the part of her mind that was still cataloging even now. Then the lights in the corridor shifted, an emergency protocol engaging, and then there were men moving through the building with the compressed urgency of people executing a plan they had rehearsed, and then there was gunfire on the outer walls, 2 positions at once, and the building became a different building than it had been for the past 6 days. She was already moving, not toward the exits, not toward the eastern gate, which she noted was no longer an option anyway. The Shin faction had almost certainly covered the perimeter, toward the medical suite, because the medical suite was where the monitors were, and the monitors were what she needed. She reached the suite in 40 seconds and looked at the screen, and her stomach tightened in a way she recognized as the body's appropriate response to a genuinely bad piece of information. Jae-won's cardiac markers had crossed the threshold she had designated as the surgical threshold. Not by a small amount, by a margin that told her the stress response to the attack had triggered an acceleration she had been hoping to avoid for another 24 hours. The window she had been managing with careful daily treatment was closing, and it was closing now, tonight, under fire, without the conditions she had planned for. She looked at the monitors for exactly 3 seconds. She pulled her surgical case from the cabinet and set it on the table and opened it. She put on her gloves. Min-jun was in the doorway. She looked at him. She thought about the pages on the desk and the conversation that had just happened, and the sister and the 11 months. She held all of it in her mind simultaneously, the way she held a complex differential, and she made the decision that the situation required. She needed him. She needed him specific and functional and present in this room for the next several hours, and what he had done and what it meant could not be in this room with them, or she would not have what she needed from him. She said, "Hold the room. Keep everyone out. When Jae-won gets here, I need him in the chair." He looked at her. She said, "I know, not now. Hold the room." Something passed across his face that she didn't have time to inventory. He took his position at the door. Jae-won arrived 4 minutes later with 2 of his men and blood on his shirt that she did not think was his. She checked, quickly, running her eyes over him before he sat, because the last thing she needed was an unaccounted wound, and he sat in the chair and looked at her and said nothing. She said, "I need to operate. Now. Tonight. The markers have crossed the threshold and I cannot wait for better conditions." He said, "Do what you need to do." She said, "The sedative supply is limited. I don't have enough for the full procedure. You're going to be conscious for the first portion." He said, "Then I'll be conscious." She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she turned to the case. 2 hours and 47 minutes. She knew the duration precisely because she tracked time during procedures with the automatic accuracy of a person for whom time was a clinical variable, the same way she tracked the monitor readings and the instrument positions, and the physiological responses to each intervention. She tracked it because, in a procedure this length, time was information. The gunfire outside was intermittent for the first hour. Organized exchanges, the sound of a perimeter being contested rather than breached, which meant Jae-won's men were holding. She registered this in the background of her attention, the way she registered everything that was not the immediate problem, noted and filed and not prioritized. The immediate problem was the man in front of her. She had designed this protocol in Johannesburg and had rehearsed it in her mind many times since, in the way surgeons rehearsed procedures they might someday need, not obsessively, but with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understood that preparation and luck were not the same thing and only one of them was under her control. She had designed it for a single surgeon, working with limited resources in a non-ideal environment, because that was the environment she had been in, and she had not been able to design for anything she didn't have. She worked through the first sequence. He was conscious, and she was aware of him being conscious, the particular quality of stillness that a person produces when they are experiencing pain and have decided not to let it produce noise. She had asked him to tell her if the pain entered a range that was clinically significant versus the range that was simply the expected discomfort of an awake surgical patient, and he had said yes, and he did not say anything for 40 minutes. He watched her hands. She had noticed this in every procedure. From the first day, the consistent focus on her hands rather than her face, the quality of attention directed at the work rather than the person doing it. She understood it differently now than she had on day one. On day one, she had registered it as the behavior of a controlled person managing a difficult situation. Now she understood it as something more specific. He was watching her hands the way she had once watched the hands of a senior surgeon whose work she had considered exemplary, with the focused attention of someone who was learning the shape of a skill they recognized as rare. At 43 minutes, she administered the first portion of the sedative supply, and his eyes closed, and she shifted into the part of the procedure that required the full depth of her concentration, the part she had been building toward across 6 days of preparation. The specific intervention that the Johannesburg data told her was the difference between reversal and management. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. She registered this without redirecting her attention. Stopped could mean many things. She did not have the bandwidth to determine which one right now. The monitor was alarmed at 2 hours and 19 minutes. The cardiac marker line dropped in the specific pattern she had been watching for and dreading, the flatline threat, the physiological cliff edge that the compound could produce when the reversal protocol triggered the final metabolic response, the moment she had documented in the Johannesburg case as the crisis point, the moment where the outcome was determined by the next 60 seconds of decision. She did not panic. Panic was a physiological state that contracted decision-making capacity precisely when decision-making capacity was the critical resource, and she had trained it out of herself in her residency, the same way she had trained the retreat reflex out of her expression through sustained, deliberate practice across situations that kept getting harder, until the training was deeper than the instinct. She moved. Fast. Precise. Every motion, the product of 6 days of preparation and 3 years of carrying the Johannesburg data, and 19 years of training that had been building toward exactly this kind of moment, in exactly this kind of room, under exactly this kind of pressure. She had known, somewhere beneath consciousness, that she had been building toward something specific when she spent all those late hours with the protocol, and this was it, and her hands knew what to do. The monitor's line held. Then it moved in the direction she needed it to move. She watched it for 15 seconds, tracking the trajectory, confirming that it was stable and moving correctly, and not a temporary recovery that would fall again. It held. It moved. It kept moving. She exhaled. The procedure concluded at 4:23 a.m. She stepped back from the table and stood still for a moment, her hands at her sides, the specific internal silence that followed a completed procedure settling through her. She had experienced this silence many times. It was the silence of a thing that had been at risk and was now resolved. The silence of a closed parenthesis, a period at the end of a sentence that had been very long and had been in danger of ending differently. His vitals were stable. He was alive. She looked at the monitor for a moment more, confirming the trajectory, confirming the numbers, confirming that she was reading them correctly, and not with the distorted perception that could come from extended concentration and the specific hope that she had been trying not to name for 6 days. She took off her gloves. She sat down on the floor beside the operating table because her legs had decided, with the quiet authority of the body asserting its claims after a long period of deferral, that this was sufficient for now. She had been holding something back for 8 days. The tears arrived without drama and without announcement, not the kind that came with a sound, but the kind that simply happened, the body disposing of something it had been carrying in the only way it knew how. She sat on the floor and did not try to stop them, and did not produce any particular narrative about what they were for. A hand came down from the table, slowly, his arm extended toward the floor, his fingers finding hers in the specific and unhurried way of someone who had woken from sedation and had immediately located the most important thing in the room. His hand covered hers. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The monitor kept its steady rhythm. The city outside was beginning to lighten, the specific gray that preceded Seoul's dawn arriving in the window above the desk, the first suggestion of a day that had not existed yet, 12 hours ago. She sat on the floor with his hand over hers until the room had filled enough with morning light that the lamp on the desk was no longer the primary source of illumination. Then she squeezed once, briefly, and stood up and began the post-operative notes. He was sitting up by early afternoon. She had checked his vitals 4 times since dawn, once every 2 hours, exactly, because the post-operative period for this protocol had its own set of variables to track, and she intended to track them with the same precision she had applied to everything else. Each check had told her what she needed to know. The procedure had worked, the reversal was holding, the toxin's progression had been stopped at the point she had needed to stop it, and his body, which had been losing a war for 6 weeks, had turned a corner. She sat in the chair beside the table and told him about Min-jun. She did it the way she delivered any difficult diagnosis information first, in sequence, with the reasoning made visible, because her experience was that people received hard information better when they understood the logic of it, rather than simply receiving the conclusion. She told him what she had found in the progression data. She told him what the supply records showed. She told him about the redirected attentions and the delayed supplies and the pattern they formed when arranged correctly. She told him about the conversation in the medical suite and what Min-jun had said. Then she told him about the sister. She told him about the sister last because that was where the information's weight resided, and she had learned to build toward the weight rather than lead with it. He went very still. Not the stillness she had catalogued in the first days, the managed stillness of a man controlling his presentation, the enforced immobility of someone keeping a performance running. This was different. This was the stillness of a man absorbing a piece of information that had reached somewhere below all the trained responses and was being felt there, in the unmanaged interior, in the place that didn't have a trained response, because it had never needed one for this. He sat with it. She sat with him, sitting with it. She did not add anything. She had delivered the diagnosis. It was his now. Min-jun was brought in 20 minutes later. He stood across the table from Jae-won and he did not try to manage his face, which was the thing she had not expected from him, that when the moment came, he would stop managing. He told Jae-won about his sister, and about the 11 months, and about the specific calculation he had made, and the specific terms of the arrangement, and his voice was the flattest she had ever heard it, which was the flatness of someone who had decided that the only honest thing left was to give the account without performing anything around it. The room was very quiet when he finished. Jae-won said, "Where is she now?" Min-jun said, "I don't know. They moved her 3 weeks ago." Jae-won looked at him for a moment that contained a great many things she was not going to try to read. Then he said 2 words to the man standing beside the door, quietly, in Korean, and the man left. He did not give another order in her presence. He did not say anything else to Min-jun directly, but Min-jun's posture, when he left the room, was the posture of a man who understood completely and without ambiguity that the life he had been living inside these walls was over, regardless of what came next. She had seen this posture before, in patients receiving a terminal prognosis, the specific compression of a person who has understood that a door has closed and will not reopen. She stayed in her chair. Jae-won was at the window by the time the room had emptied. He had moved there without her noticing, which meant she had been looking at her hands rather than the room, which was not something she did often and was itself information she noted without comment. She stood and crossed to the window and sat beside him. She did not say anything clinical. She did not offer an analysis of Min-jun's motivations or a framework for understanding betrayal or any of the other things her brain was capable of producing on demand when a situation required something from her, and she was not sure what. She had done that enough times in enough difficult rooms to know that it was not always the thing the situation required. She simply sat beside him. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the quality of the light in the window shifted from afternoon to early evening without either of them marking it. He said, eventually, without turning from the window, "I built this in 7 years. From what my father left and what I added to it. Every person in this compound, I chose them. I trusted them with things you don't trust people with unless you intend to keep trusting them." He stopped. "And it happens anyway," he said. "Eventually, it always does." She thought about what to say. She went through several options and discarded them for the same reason they were true, but they were not the specific truth that this moment needed. She said, "You trusted me." He turned to look at her. "And I was the wrong person," she said. "I wasn't the surgeon you sent for. I wasn't the person your intelligence identified. I arrived by accident in the wrong parking structure at the wrong time, and your men grabbed me by mistake. You kept me anyway, and you gave me access to everything I needed, and you answered every condition I put in front of you, and you watched my hands for 6 days. That was trust, extended to the wrong person." She held his gaze. "And here we are," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. His voice had the particular quality she had first identified on the first morning. Not loud, not constructed, just the simple weight of a thing he had decided was true. "You were exactly the right person. They just grabbed you by accident." The distinction sat in the room between them. She understood why it mattered to him, and she understood why it mattered to her, and she did not say either of those things out loud, because some things were more accurately expressed by the fact of sitting at a window together at dusk than by anything that could be said about it. They sat until the city below them had finished its transition to night, and Seoul was entirely itself again, lit, glittering, alive, the specific, brilliant indifference of a city that had been doing this without them and would continue doing it regardless of what decisions were made in this room. She went back to the medical suite and wrote the evening notes and updated the post-operative record and sat for a while with the research paper draft she had been carrying in her bag since before any of this happened, and found that she had new material to add. The 10th day arrived the way the first 9 had arrived, with Seoul and winter light and the sound of the compound's baseline frequency, which she had become so familiar with that its absence would have been as informative as its presence. But the 10th day was different. The Shin faction's leadership had been dismantled overnight, using the intelligence that Min-jun's full disclosure had made available, the locations, the contacts, the operational structure of the organization that had been positioning itself against Jae-won's compound for months. Nuella had spent 2 hours the previous afternoon helping Min-jun organize his information into a format that was useful for the purpose, because she had the kind of structured analytical mind that found organization satisfying regardless of the subject matter, And because she had decided that this was the last useful thing she could do in this situation, and she intended to do it properly, the result had been processed overnight through Jae-won's network. By the time the compound woke up on the 10th morning, the threat that had been driving everything for the past week no longer existed in the form it had taken. She sat with this information for a while. The poison was gone. She had verified this in the morning check, the compound's markers at a level she had designated as clinically clear, the cardiac function tracking within the normal range, the reversal holding exactly as the protocol predicted it would hold. The threat was gone. The procedure was complete. Her conditions had been fulfilled. She sat at the desk in the medical suite and looked at the treatment record she had been keeping for 10 days, precise, thorough, a complete documentation of every decision she had made and why. The kind of record she had always kept because she believed that the work you did should be legible to the next person who needed to understand it. Then she took her medical bag from the cabinet. She packed it the way she always packed it, instruments in their case, documentation in the side pocket, the research paper draft in the front pocket where it had been for 3 weeks now. Her hospital ID returned to the interior strap where it belonged. She checked the contents against the list in her head, the same list she had maintained since her first year of residency, and everything was there. She carried the bag to the top floor. The room with the floor-to-ceiling window was empty. She stood at the glass and looked at Namsan Tower and the city below it, and the Han River catching the morning light the way it caught it every morning, whether she was here to see it or not. Her apartment was down there. The coffee maker was on its timer. The subway platform was filling with people who had places to be. She thought about the research paper. It was late, but it was also more complete than it had been 2 weeks ago. And she thought that the additional material she had gathered over the past 10 days would make it something considerably more significant than what she had been planning to submit. There was a section she needed to add about second-instance reversal under time pressure. There was data she had now that she hadn't had before. She thought about the hospital, about the trauma bay she had been working in for 3 years, the attending who left early and the supply cart dinners and the cases she finished alone because that was what the work required. She thought about the particular satisfaction of it, not the conditions, which were poor, but the work itself, which was the reason she had come here and the reason she had stayed, and which had not changed. She stood at the window with her bag and thought about all of it. She heard him before she saw him. She had been hearing him this way for days. The particular quality his silence had, the way it arrived in a room before he did, a change in the air's density that she had catalogued without meaning to and could not now uncatalogue. It was the specific signature of a presence. She had become attuned to the way you became attuned to the sounds of a hospital you had worked in long enough, the baseline against which you measured deviation. She heard him come into the room. She did not turn around. She heard his footsteps cross the space between the door and where she was standing, unhurried, deliberate. The gait of someone who had decided what they were going to do and was not second-guessing the decision in transit. She tracked him in her peripheral vision, and when he stopped, she turned. He was on one knee. The city of Seoul spread behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass, 100,000 lights, Namsan Tower in the distance, the Han River, a dark ribbon beyond the city's edge. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle that made Seoul look like a city that had been designed specifically to look like this, from this height at this time of day. He was silhouetted against all of it, with one knee on the floor and one hand extended, palm open, facing up, not reaching for her, not closing the distance, just open, present, available. She looked at him. She had been trained to look at people precisely, to read what the body communicated before the voice did, to identify what was concealed and what was offered. She looked at him with that precision, and she saw everything his face was showing, which was more than it had shown in any moment over the previous 10 days. The hand was not quite steady. This man, who had sat conscious through an open procedure in a room with active gunfire outside its walls, who had commanded a war council without raising his voice, who had maintained the architecture of control through 6 days of illness and siege and betrayal, his hand, extended to her, was trembling slightly. She had one word from him. "Stay." Just that, spoken quietly, in the voice that had never needed volume to carry its full weight. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the Eastern Gate on day 4, and the 11 minutes, and the question she had still not fully answered to herself. She thought about the Johannesburg patient, the 47 hours, the paper that almost no one read and that had nonetheless arrived, through the most improbable chain of events she had ever been part of, in the hands of the person who needed it. She thought about his hand over hers at 4:23 a.m., on the floor of the medical suite, extended without demand, simply there. She thought about the peculiar precision of accident, the wrong parking structure, the wrong parking level, the wrong woman, the wrong timing, all of it colliding into something that had turned out, against all probability and design, to be the right thing. She looked at her medical bag. She looked at his open hand. She set the bag down. Not forever. She was not capable of forever in this particular moment, and she did not pretend otherwise, because she had spent her entire professional life refusing to promise outcomes she could not guarantee, and she was not about to start now, not with any architecture of commitment she could fully map yet. Just this, tonight, and then whatever came after tonight, and then however many mornings it took to understand what shape this was going to take. He stood. He did not reach for her. He simply stood close, in the way she had watched him learn to stand close over the past 10 days, near enough that the proximity was a fact, not so near that it became a pressure. He had learned to wait because she had not specifically taught him but had made it necessary, and he had responded to necessity the way she responded to every difficult parameter, by finding a way to work within it. She looked at him, standing there with Seoul behind him. "I need my phone back," she said. "And I need to submit a paper by Friday." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a full smile. The architecture of his face was not built for something that unguarded, but the indication of one, brief and real. "I'll get you a new phone." "And the paper." "And the paper." She stood in the silence that followed that. And it was a different silence from any of the other silences she had occupied in this building over the past 10 days. Those had been silences of waiting for the next development, the next procedure, the next data point that would tell her which direction the situation was moving. This one was not waiting for anything. It was simply itself, full of the particular completeness of a thing that had arrived at its destination. Outside, Seoul, alive and glittering, and entirely indifferent to what had just been decided in this room, which was fine, because some decisions didn't require the city's attention to be real. She looked at the table by the window, where she had set her bag. Beside it, on the lacquer surface where he had placed it without ceremony, was his signet ring, the dragon crest, the gold, the thing that had been on his hand every day for as long as she had been watching his hands. He had placed it there the way she had placed the bag, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just set it down. Two things on a table. Two people who had both had somewhere else to be, who had arrived here by different routes and by mistake, who had spent 10 days in a building under siege with a poison and a traitor and a window that kept closing, and who were standing now in the morning light with the city at their backs. She picked up her hospital ID from where it had been on the desk and clipped it back onto her bag strap where it belonged. Then she sat down at the window, and he sat beside her, and Seoul kept going below them the way it always did, brilliant and enormous and alive, keeping its own time, making its own decisions, moving forward without waiting for anyone to tell it how.